Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled Agrarianism in the Gilded Age. We want to talk in this lecture about agrarianism as a counter to the hegemony of industrial, financial, and corporate capitalism. So let me talk a little bit about how this response by farmers to the new capitalist ethos happened. They offered these farmers a classical Republican critique of industrial and financial capitalism. In the 1930s through the 1990s, historians battled to understand agrarianism and its political face, populism. Let's look at agrarianism through the lens of three organizations or movements that arose after the Civil War. And we can trace the emergence of agrarian critiques of both American government and the change in economics of the Gilded Age, and see how agrarians, like so many other movements, began as voluntary self-help societies that morphed into or added a political party. First and most long-lasting of these organizations we'll discuss is the Grange, also known as the Patrons of Husbandry. It was organized in 1867 by Minnesota farmer activist Oliver Kelly, pictured here. It peaked in 1880, but it even continues today. The Grange is a fraternity to represent farmers, sort of like unions represented workers. It stressed education, emotional support, fellowship. It urged farmers to buy less and produce more. It sought cooperative buying and selling arrangements, and it lobbied states to regulate railroads, which before the 20th century was the bête noire of all consumers. The second of these organizations is the Farmers Alliance and Agricultural Wheel, so called after they merged in 1889. The Farmers Alliance lasted from the 1870s into the 1890s, and it was a response to falling agricultural prices as well as the demise of yeoman farming after the Civil War. The Farmers Alliance was strong particularly in the South. The Southern Alliance was developed in Texas and led by Charles McCune. The Northern Alliance was in Nebraska and other Plains states, and unlike so many other organizations, the Alliance created its own auxiliary or a second alliance for African American farmers, which was called the Colored Alliance. It merged with the Agricultural Wheel, which was in Arkansas in 1889, and its leaders were, in addition to Charles McCune of Texas, I've been unable to find a photograph of him, though I've tried for years, was Tom Watson, shown on the far right, from Georgia, who became, after the failure of populism in the 1890s, a rabid racist and ran in Georgia for multiple offices based on an extreme racist position. And Mary Lease, who you see here, who was one of the first female lawyers in Kansas and was an incredibly popular orator, who is famous for urging Kansas farmers to raise less corn and more hell. The program of the Farmers Alliance Agricultural Wheel stressed local and state cooperative purchasing and marketing arrangements. It was politicized in the St. Louis platform of 1888 that we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, but two of the most important parts of that platform for the politics of the era and the political economy of the era was that the Wheel and the Alliance proposed what's been called a sub-treasury system, in which the federal government would build agricultural warehouses, store non-perishable crops for farmers, make loans to the farmers in cash, totaling 80% of the supposed value of those crops in storage, add 1% interest. And then instead of selling the crops right away so that there was a glut at harvest time and prices were low, would hold these crops until the glut was over and could sell the crops on the market for more money. When the Fed sold the crops in this sub-treasury concept, then the money would go to pay off the loan at 1% interest, and then the money would then be distributed back to the farmers if it came in at more than what the farmers had borrowed. Another part of the St. Louis platform that the Farmers Alliance Agricultural Wheel promoted that's important to us is currency reform. They wanted the amount of circulating money to be based on gross domestic product, which is what we do today, not the amount of gold and silver in circulation, or rather held by the U.S. government. So they weren't even bimetallists. They were much more advanced in their thinking about how much money should be in the economy. The last organization we want to talk about is the Populists. The Populists, also known as the People's Party, was a third political party that emerged because of agrarian discontent. In many cases and many places, it included factory labor allies. The Populist Party arose alongside the Farmers Alliance and, of course, the Grange, and performed a different function. It was a straight-ahead political party that sought offices and sought to influence policy. Populists at the state and national level wanted increased democracy, and they wanted currency reform. They offered a political critique of representative democracy as it was then practiced as being too narrow. It also offered an economic critique of the U.S. economy as being too pro-corporate and being, quite frankly, behind the times. Let's look now at the emergence of populist politics. In 1892, the People's Party, the Populist Party, formed, and they adopted the Omaha Platform. The Omaha Platform came from McCune's 1888 St. Louis Platform and pretty much mirrors it with some small changes. It was written by Ignatius Donnelly, pictured here, who was a colorful Minnesota politician, and you probably know him best because of his work promoting the concept of the missing continent, Atlantis. This platform argued that a democratic federal government was there to protect the weak from the strong. The platform argued that the government should own communications and transportation infrastructure and businesses. They asked for the free coinage of silver and paper currency based on $50 per person. This is just one metric to determine the amount of money in the economy. Gold bugs use the metric of the amount of gold bullion held by the government in Fort Knox. Silverites wanted the government to buy and mint as much silver as it could buy, with 16 ounces of silver worth the same as 1 ounce of gold. Today, we base the amount of money in our economy, like the agricultural wheel did, on the gross domestic product. The Omaha Platform also called for a progressive income tax. The more you make, the higher the percentage you pay. It called for the direct election of senators, which did not happen until the mid-19-teens with the passage of the 17th Amendment, I believe. Until that time, senators were elected by state legislatures. It called for the 8-hour day for factory labor, and it called for the same sub-treasury scheme for creating agricultural credit that the Alliance had called for. Its first candidate for president was Union General James Weaver, who garnered 1 million votes in the 1892 election. The important election for the Populists, however, was the 1896 election. Populists co-opted, some by Democrats, others by Republicans. Generally at the local level, if the Democrats had been in charge for any length of time, the Populists allied with weak Republican parties. In places where the Republican Party was strong and controlled either states or cities, then the Populists often allied with Democratic parties. And this is called fusion at the time. It's still called fusion today. Bimetallism, this idea of minting gold and silver, became mainstream populist programming. Politicians took over the official party. For example, William Jennings Bryan, showed here, made his famous Cross of Gold speech and got the Democratic nomination for president. The populists held their convention after the GOP and after the Democrats did, and so hoping to garner civil rights from both of those parties, fused with the Democrats at the national level and nominated William Jennings Bryan as the populist candidate for president as well. That is to say that the National Populist Party joined with the National Democratic Party. Now, populists and the Democrats lost the election handily to McKinley, and Bryan went on to run at least twice more for president. He went on to be Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State, and he died shortly after testifying for the prosecution in the 1925 Scopes monkey trial. Populist reform impulse failed after 1896, but what is it that really killed it? Internal divisions within the party, primarily over fusion and over bimetallism as the leading problem of the day, helped to kill the party. The return of prosperity after 1897, the jingoism of the Spanish-American War that looked badly upon anyone who dissented, and a change in the class dynamics of the reform movement. All of these things killed the populist reform impulse. So in summary, agrarianism looked backwards to a time when yeoman farmers were the Jeffersonian ideal of Americans, independent producers who engaged very little with the market. They were unbeholden to anyone for anything. That ideal, however, was a myth. It had never really existed except as a legend. Even by the time of Jefferson's inauguration as president in 1803, this ideal was on its way to extinction. But agrarians were not merely critics of the emerging industrial and corporate order of the Gilded Age. They did not merely reject corporations and the government that supported businesses, but sought government programs and self-help projects that benefited small farmers as much as manufacturers, financiers, and agribusiness. Agrarians built voluntary organizations to ameliorate problems of rural life, particularly isolation and poverty, and built pressure groups, almost like labor unions, to advocate for governmental policies in support of their economic and social positions. Now, Americans usually turn this kind of advocacy into political action. Our electoral system channels such energy. So it's no surprise that agrarians formed the backbone of the People's Party, also known as the Populists. The agrarians' political program, articulated in the St. Louis platform of the agricultural wheel in 1888 and the Omaha platform of the Populist Party of 1892, this latter written by Ignatius Donnelly, included the monetarization of silver as only one plank. This was to inflate the currency, to ease debtors, and to allow for even more and even and robust economic growth. But by 1896, bimetallism had become the single issue in the presidential campaign, splitting the Populist Party that nominated the Democratic pro-silver nominee William Jennings Bryan as their own presidential candidate. The stinging defeat of Bryan by McKinley, the jingoism of the Spanish-American War, the return of prosperity, and the changing class nature of the emerging reform movement that we'll call progressivism, buried populism as a distinct movement. American farmers have been replaced as the leading edge of the economy and as the hegemon of American culture and society. And with this, I'll end the lecture, and as always, thanks for your attention.